as therapists in private practice, we have all had the situation where we do an intake call with a client, we think that we're a really good fit, we've done a lot of our due diligence, and then they come in for our first session, and all of a sudden we realize, oh man, this client and I are not a good fit, and I need to tell them. This is a tricky situation to navigate, and in today's video, I'm going to break down exactly how I have this hard conversation. Before we get started, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Kelly Stevens. I teach therapists how to build thriving private practices, and you are watching video 1 in a series of how to handle tricky conversations in private practice. I also have all of these scripts that I give you in this series and in this video in a digital PDF, and I will link it down below. But let's get into this situation. So you have a client who comes in for a first session. They have already filled out your client paperwork. They've already filled out all of your intake information. They have already gone over all the details of therapy. You're midway through that very first session, or sometimes even the second session, which is even trickier. And you realize, for whatever reason it is, that you guys are not a good fit. Now, one thing I've really realized about this scenario is that clients very quickly form an attachment to their therapist, meaning they have found somebody, you, who is a safe person to talk to, right? And even just going through that process as a client can be really exhausting. Also, a lot of clients come into therapy. Sometimes it's the very first time they've ever seen a therapist, and it can feel like, oh my gosh, if this therapist is not the right fit, then I maybe will never find somebody who is. And if you tell them that you're not the right fit, you might be worried that they feel some sort of rejection, something like that. I know those are the things that go through my head as a therapist when I am trying to navigate this situation. What I have really learned to do over the years is to say some version of this. Typically, I lead with, I'm so sorry. I want to stop you right here. This thing that you just said, ideally they've said something about what is going on for them. This thing that you just said really struck me as something that is outside of my area of expertise. When we originally got on our call, thought that you were struggling with X, Y, and Z. What I'm hearing you tell me is that you're actually struggling with this other thing. And unfortunately, that's outside of what I do as a therapist. However, before we go any further, I want you to know the most important predictor of a client's success in therapy is how good of a fit they have with their therapist. And my job as a therapist is to make sure we find that really good fit. And as you're talking, I think that that person is not me, but I am going to help you figure out who it is. Now, at this point, a lot of clients will have some big feelings about this, right? They've spent a lot of time doing your intake process. They might feel like, why didn't you realize this sooner? They might feel like they've wasted so much time. They might even feel like they've wasted money. So when I'm going through this, the first thing I do is I pause and I say to the client, tell me what you are feeling about this. Sometimes the client will say, you know what? I actually think you're right. I think that I am looking for somebody who is more fill in the blank. Quite often, the client will say, I don't understand what you're talking about. We've already talked on the phone. We've already hit it off, whatever it is. I don't get it. And then I'll kind of say in different words, something like, I totally understand that. I would be really overwhelmed and frustrated if somebody said this to me. Maybe if I had gone to a doctor that I thought was going to help me with my eyes and it turned out they were a kidney specialist or something like that. I'll give some sort of kind of medical analogy and I'll say, the tough part with therapy is that each of us as therapists kind of have our wheelhouse or our area of expertise. And when somebody comes into therapy, we can kind of guess that we're going to be a good fit, but until we really get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on, sometimes I don't always know. And so rather than just stringing you along and doing something outside of my expertise, I'm really realizing that I want to help you find the person that is the right fit. And I promise you, I will hold your hand through the process. I know so many therapists in town. I know the people who work with fill in the specialty you're referring them to. And we are going to work together until we find the exact right person, because that is what you deserve. Now, most of the time, clients will be totally fine with this part, right? By the time I've gotten here and I've explained it a couple times, they'll say, okay, what's the next step? How do we figure it out? And I will start to talk to them about referrals, right? I'll say, I have a colleague who works really closely with this specific thing that they might be facing. And then I'll talk and tell them about the colleague, how to get in touch with them, all of that. Also say, if you want to sign a release, I'm happy to fill them in on what we've already talked about. I'm happy to let them know anything. And if you don't want to sign a release, that's okay too, right? Other times, clients will still be frustrated at this moment, and that's okay. Your job is not always to quell that frustration. You know, I think as therapists, we oftentimes can be people pleasers, not all of us, but takes one to know one, right? And we think that we want the client, no matter what, to approve of this decision that we're making. That's not always going to be the case. Sometimes clients are going to be frustrated, and that's okay. And you can say, you know what, I totally understand why you're frustrated, and you are completely allowed to be frustrated. Now, the reason I say this is because as therapists, sometimes the best thing we can do is provide safety for hard feelings. And sometimes that hard feeling is something that you've caused, right? So right now, that client might feel rejected. They might feel overwhelmed. They might feel like they've wasted time. Those feelings are really normal. And you can say to them, you know, and then I will help you find somebody else. I often will use the phrase, I won't leave you high and dry, or I won't leave you to figure this out on your own. I will help you figure it out. Now, depending on where you're licensed in, and for the majority of the states, this is true, you really cannot leave them high and dry. You really do need to do the work to help them find somebody else. You can't just neglect them, right? So I want you to make sure that before you have this conversation, you have done the footwork to figure out who in your professional network you can refer to for different sorts of things, to figure out who in your professional network you can refer to. One question I get asked all the time is, do you give back the fee? Now, this is a tough one, and it really is up to you. I would be super curious to know in the comments. Tell me, I read my comments all the time. I want you to tell me if you would give back the fee. I have done it both ways. Sometimes I do give back the fee if the client is very, very angry about this decision. And the reason being, now in today's world with the internet, people can go on and write reviews about all sorts of things online, and it's never worth it to me to have that session fee risking that a client might go on Google and write all sorts of horrible things, right? So if a client really pushes back, then I do refund the fee. Most times, if I am able to handle this conversation with grace, with understanding, the client won't even ask. And I will have already spent that hour of my time really helping them. I will follow up with an email with all of the referrals that I would recommend and why I'm recommending them. That also helps me to keep it in writing. Also, I will make sure to document in my EHR. I personally use Simple Practice. I love them. There's a link for them below. I will write in Simple Practice exactly why I chose to discharge this client, and I'll make sure to make note of it. I never know if this is exactly the right way to do it. Again, there's no one right way. This conversation is a tricky one. I would be super interested to know how you handle it, and tune in for the rest of this series. Tell me below if there are more videos that you'd like to see and what scripts you are needing in your private practice. It always means a lot to me if you subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.